Hello, I'm Jen Uphoff Gray, founder and artistic director of Forward Theater Company in Madison, Wisconsin. And this is Theater Forward, a monthly conversation about theater from a local, regional, and national perspective. From Madison to Manhattan, we're excited to share insights into our own company while exploring issues surrounding theater here in the Midwest and around the country. Welcome to episode 118 of Theater Forward. In this episode, I am joined by the amazing Kait Kerrigan and Nathan Tysen. Kait's a playwright and musical theater lyricist and book writer. Nathan is a musical theater lyricist. They have long careers creating musicals, both separately and together, with an astounding list of credits between them, regionally, on Broadway, and worldwide. Most recently, they collaborated on the book and lyrics for The Great Gatsby, currently running on Broadway, which has just announced a national tour and a West End run. And we've talked often on this podcast about how new plays get produced. With Kait and Nathan here today, we're going to look at how new musicals get developed in this industry. What are the resources out there? What are the obstacles? Why does so much great material die on the vine? And for that conversation, welcome Kait and Nathan.
Hi.
Thank you for having us.
It is a thrill to have you here. I am so looking forward to learning from you about how things are working these days in the musical theater factory. But as we get into that, could you both maybe start by telling us a little bit about your individual journeys as theater creators and what got you started in this field?
Sure. Would you like to go first?
We actually both started making musicals at around the same time. I was in college, the end of college. I went to Barnard and I reconnected with a friend of mine who I knew growing up, and we had done theater together. And they were writing music and I was writing plays, and we started talking about writing a musical together. And we did speaking of new musical development, we did the first new musical theater festival, which was in 2004, I think. And we did the second one in 2005. And then from there, I got a commission from a national company that tours kids shows called TheaterWorks USA to write a children's show called Henry and Mudge.
So many people started with TheaterWorks USA.
So many, yes, both actors and writers and directors and choreographers. It's crazy, the pipeline there. And then and it was an amazing opportunity because it was actually the first time I felt like any kind of solvency connected to writing. And then from there, I did a show that eventually became called The Mad Ones, which was off Broadway in 2017. We started writing it in 2005, which is a statement about how long it takes to get a 4-person musical developed.
Yeah.
And then in the meantime, there were a lot of other projects that were that happened, that didn't happen, and eventually, I've been developing several new musicals. I did the book. I did additional lyrics for The Time Traveler's Wife, with Lauren Gunderson writing the book, and I have a show opening in. At the Leicester Curve this spring in the UK, and we have The Great Gatsby running on Broadway.
Excuse me. I'm Nathan, and I actually got bit by the theater writing bug in high school because of a summer camp that I went to with your marketing director, Scott Hayden.
Yay!
And thanks to Scott, actually, he was like, you should check out this summer camp. And there was a camp called Lovewell Institute for the Creative Arts, where they take 30 kids from all over the U.S. and they write a full-length musical in 3 weeks. So you think you're going there to be the star of the show, and then you realize you have to write all the stuff first. And I wrote my first songs and kind of never looked back. I ended up going to grad school at NYU in 1999. There's a musical theater writing program where you can get your master's degree in musical theater writing. And so graduated in 2001, and my thesis musical, which I wrote with Chris Miller, who's the composer, and I've been writing with him since the day I met him in 99, was my first show in New York. It's an off-Broadway show. that happened at Playwrights Horizons in 2010. So 9 years from graduating school to finally getting a production in New York. I since have had 4 Broadway shows. Happy to talk about any of them: Tuck Everlasting, Amelie, Paradise Square, and now The Great Gatsby. But I didn't start writing full time until the month before we started rehearsal for Tuck Everlasting in 2014. So it was a good 13 years of just random jobs and submitting and trying to make things happen. And a lot of theaters have helped a lot of the way. There's a lot of grants out there that have helped along the way, although they're sadly diminishing, which is rough. I think for new writers. Happy to talk about any of that. But here we are now. Overnight successes. 25 years in New York. Finally have a hit on
25-year overnight.
Yes.
Yeah. Amazing. And thank you for both giving that overview. And yeah, I would like to hear more about some of the developmental experiences that you've had, because I think that's the thing people don't understand is you don't write a musical and then open it on Broadway. It's not like you don't go from that point A to point B. It's A to Z. And there's usually a very long and winding road in between. Mm-hmm. And, maybe pick a particular piece for each of you that is, a particularly interesting journey that it had. But, how do you go from I've got an idea for a show, or a colleague of mine has an idea for a show who wants to collaborate with me, to a show that's actually being done in a full production?
There's a couple different angles of that. And the one that I'm the most interested in changing in our industry personally is the one that's connected to what used to be called the calling card musical. When we were first coming up, the idea was write a show for 4 or 5 people and do it off Broadway, do it at a regional theater, do it somewhere and get some experience. And it is by far the best way to become a better writer, is to put your shows up and have them in front of a paying audience and be in that smaller ecosystem before you go to Broadway. And I don't know any writer who didn't want to do that first. We all wanted to do the small version and then do the big version. And the thing that happened around the year 2000 was that off Broadway, the way that the contracts worked, the way that things behind the scenes happened, it all kind of fell apart. And there was no space, especially for commercial off Broadway, but even off Broadway, when it comes to musicals, they're very expensive. And so what not-for-profit off Broadway became something that you had to have a commercial producer attached to it. And you had to have somebody who was putting in a great deal of money. And that was the only path to getting it produced off Broadway. And that meant that it had to have the possibility of going to Broadway. And so these smaller musicals that never were intended to have a massive appeal or to have be a star vehicle, which are sort of the two options, they don't get produced. And so what happened around like 2003, 2004, was that the internet sort of took the place of that, and people started putting all of their songs online, and people started using that as the way of figuring out how to develop an audience. And so as a result, like we're very lucky to have very direct relationships with the people who love our songs. The downside of that is it looks like people only know how to write songs, or you don't actually get to see what the whole piece is. And so for example, the show that I did that was eventually called The Mad Ones, it had commercial producers. We went out of town with it. They couldn't figure out the finances of it. They looked at Broadway. They looked at off Broadway. The prices were kind of the same, but you couldn't brand it to go to Broadway without it going off Broadway, and you would have lost your shirt going off Broadway. So you couldn't do that. And therefore, you ended up in this situation where the producers ended up having to say, we can't figure it out. And as a result of not being able to figure it out without a star attached to it, and by star, I mean like a film star, without that, then we couldn't do the show. And so a show that was on track to be off Broadway in 2010, 2011, around then, ended up off Broadway in a teeny tiny non-commercial, completely independently funded theater called Prospect Theater, which has a small season in New York City. We ended up doing that in 2017 and basically doing an Indiegogo campaign to get it out of our house and licensed, which is all we wanted. And now the show happens all over the country, and it's happening in Argentina and London this year. It had an amazing run outside of London, and now has transferred to London this spring. And so, like, it's a kind of show that there's room for in theater, but there was no room for the development of it in the way that things get developed in New York City, if that makes sense.
It does, and it's not too dissimilar to some of the struggles that I know playwrights have doing straight plays around the country. If something's going to have with our fabulous Lauren Gunderson being kind of the exception that proves the rule, if a playwright is going to get their play licensed by theaters all over the country, it has to have that New York run. And New York runs want things to originate in New York. You know, it's very unusual for a new play to like start. I mean, maybe if it's at Steppenwolf or the Goodman, it might start there. But, you know, they want the big world premieres to be here in New York and not interested in things that start in the regionals. I'm curious if you have observed, are the regionals, the regional theaters doing anything to help step up to fill that developmental hole for new musicals?
There's a pretty big difference between plays and musicals and how they can be developed, mostly connected to the fact that you can't share the show that you've written without a recording. And so there's a huge financial investment that's sort of required at the top of at the outset. And that kind of investment happens in New York City. There are producers who will invest in that way. There are writers who will invest in that way. But for example, I was thinking of another counter example in playwriting, which is like Eureka Day happened at, I think it happened at the Aurora Theater first in California. And then I think it happened a couple other places. And now it's on Broadway with MTC. And I think that there is a pathway because you can read the play. Yeah. And it reads almost as well as watching it. And you can imagine it really easily, but reading a lyric doesn't work very well. Correct. And so when I have a show that's happened a couple times regionally, but without there being some kind of commitment. Like I think the New Play Network is a really good example of something that we don't have in musicals that you have in plays, where you can do like a five-step world premiere of a show. Something like that could be really useful for musicals, but it would require people to commit to it without knowing exactly what it was. Whereas when it's a play and you can read the script, you can kind of see the whole recipe. You can like practically smell the stew cooking on the stovetop. But with a musical, there's a bigger risk. There's also potentially a bigger reward. Yeah. But that risk, I think, would have to be mitigated by like so many people buying into the idea of like, no, we all are saying as a network, we're going to develop new musicals, because that isn't the kinds of musicals we want to be doing at a small theater throughout the country isn't going to happen in New York anymore.
Right. But my takeaway, and tell me if I'm wrong, it's tricky. Like coming out of grad school, kind of what I was taught was like, get to know these regional theaters. You know, there's something called National Alliance for Musical Theater. Every year, maybe they select 10 to 15 shows that are given 45-minute presentations in New York. And a lot of regional theaters use that time to come to New York to go see these new shows, and then also see whatever else is happening in New York. And you do an AMT and you shake hands and you get to know these theaters and you build these relationships of people that are interested in new work. And I would always then send my ideas and my demos or whatever to the theaters directly. I don't think that happens anymore. When I'm doing that, I also have to be introducing them to whoever's going to enhance the show.
Yeah.
Like there's a second step now. You have to have a producer, no matter how big the show is, 5 people, 10 people, 20 people. You have to be throwing money into it.
Someone has to.
Someone has to. And I assume it's like, the regional theater's like, listen, we're willing to take a risk on this because it's a new show and who knows if we're going to sell any tickets. So that's what we're bringing to the table, but you're going to have to pay for the thing. Right. And it just doesn't seem fair, especially for shows that don't seem like 100% like commercial.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the thing that's missing is that there are ways to get your jukebox musical produced, but the new musicals that are not based on something else, the new musicals that are not based on IP, those are the ones that are suffering, and they're really, really rare, and they can be. They are the ones that are most likely to win a Pulitzer. They're the ones that are most likely to actually put a theater on the map. But the risk and the relationship, I mean, it's producers that will take that risk more than it is theaters has been my experience. Yeah. Now you mentioned NAMPT, and I think that that's a good example. There are a couple organizations that really do exist, and they connect writers with theaters. The NAMPT method is cool, but for me, at least, the majority of the relationships that I built off of that ended up leading to moments where I was able to connect with a theater when I had a commercial property for them. Mm-hmm. And so they loved the thing I made that wasn't run by a commercial engine, and I developed that relationship with them then. And then it was when I came in with an investor and a producer, and I said, "Hey, I have the thing that I can give you now." And then immediately they jumped, and that was really cool. But it's still connected back to what Nathan's talking about.
Yeah. So what I'm really hearing, and again, knew this, but it's really wonderful to hear it with the level of specificity that you can bring to it from your own experience, is as with so much of the nonprofit arts sector, but at a sort of amplified degree because the costs involved, you can't develop challenging new work without philanthropic support or commercial financial support.
Yes.
Yep. And there are people in the country, in the world, whatever, who are willing to put some commercial financial support as investors behind things. And there are fewer and fewer and fewer philanthropic resources to support, whether it's investing in, grants for early career music or mid-career musical theater writers, whether it's investing in grants and enhancement funds that will help a small regional theater afford to do a big musical where you're going to need to come up with a recording and you're going to need to pay a bunch of musicians, and it's going to cost an exponential amount more than doing that 5-hander or 4-hander straight play. Nonprofit arts don't make any money. That's not their goal. And the smaller, non-IP, non-jukebox musicals kind of fall into that same nonprofit work model.
And I think that the thing that's really challenging, and the reason that the majority of regional theaters don't have the resources to do a musical, it's a combination of money and also institutional knowledge, because the process is different than the process of doing a play. I do a play in 3 or 4 weeks, and we have this, it feels luxurious. You just hang out, you do table work, you have them stage a little bit, you go back to doing table work, you talk, maybe you have somebody come in and talk about what it is that you're making. Maybe you have some specialists who come in and do things with what you're making. Maybe there's a fight choreographer, an intimacy director, and you have those conversations. It's so beautiful and so much fun. And then you open the show and you have 3 previews, and you do like a couple days of tech. You have 3 previews, and the show is the show, and that's kind of it. The problem with a musical is that those 4 weeks are, I mean, they are tightly packed. You have so many more people who have to be on the ground. There are so many changes that come into play during that first rehearsal process that you're in. You go through, instead of going through like 100 or 500 pages of new pages, you go through 1,000, you go through 1,500, because you have a score that's more than double the length of the script. And that all has to be reprinted every time any small thing changes. And so there's just these massive costs that are connected with all of that. You have to, in addition to like having all of those writers on the ground, you have all of the music assistants on the ground and the script assistants, and it's harder to coordinate those things. And then you go into tech, and tech is always more of an event. And every time I've done a regional show with a musical, they give you like 3 days of tech time, and it's actually impossible. And so you don't actually fully tech the show, and then you're supposed to be running it. And so like the process is a different process. And there are a few regional theaters that they know how to do musicals, and they have it built. I mean, it's still tight, but it's built to do a musical. But the majority of the smaller regionals that I've worked with trying to do a small musical, they don't have the information on the ground about how to do it. And so it feels like there's sort of 2 parts of it. One is like some kind of development fund that you're looking for to like fund 5. I just keep coming back to that rolling world premiere thing, which I think would be so helpful for musicals. But having some kind of fund that is more philanthropic and not commercially based, that could help those theaters have enough money to create those resources. And then there's also some kind of board that you would need who understand how you make a musical. So that then when those regional theaters are trying to jump in and learn how to do that, there's resources about how many pages people actually go through in a normal rehearsal process, how many people on the ground they actually need to do those things, and to be the script assistant, the music assistant, all of that stuff. It's a very big, it's a different budget than a play budget. And looking at that, I think is such an important part of, if we were to try to like fix the system in a way that's not New York based, which I think would be so cool. It feels like you would have to do something in that realm.
So in addition to an AMT, what other resources are still around to support people developing new musicals, whether it's grants, funded prizes?
There's tons of, we're just awash in readings. There are readings, there are residencies. There's plenty of opportunities to write your musical. There's no opportunities to produce your musical and like put it on its feet. The biggest problem I think is the step between the reading, the industry reading that we do, and the production. Do you disagree?
If you're lucky enough to get a reading,
Yeah.
Because readings, it's, at least in New York, you're talking $250,000, no matter how big the cast size is.
Yeah.
If you're following all the rules,
Yeah.
You know what? Maybe what we'll do, like, we could definitely compile a list for you of like the grants and the things that are there, and maybe there can be a link. I'm saying work that my buddy Scott Hayden will have to do, but like the Richard Rogers Award, which is a great one, but they only give a couple every year. Like that's money that. Like some money, like the Jonathan Larson, goes right to the writers, which is great. We all need that. We both have received that. It's fantastic.
The Claiborne Award, which we both received, is
amazing.
Another one of those.
That's just like money for the writers, but it's not for a specific project. Where like the Richard Rogers actually gives you like, I don't remember, I'm going to say it's like $60,000. But that then goes, the writers don't see any of that, but you do have money then you can shop around to a theater and be like, hey, do you want to give us a reading? We can give you some money for it.
Right.
But also super helpful. Thank you very much. So we can make a list of those, and I'm sure the Dramatist Guild has that list as well. But you know what I want to know is, I want to know, like, what are the theaters that are like, we're taking blind submissions and we have like some deep pockets to develop stuff. I mean, I think Berkeley Rep has
they have ground floor, which then can lead into something.
Yeah. TheaterWorks used to. Like,
TheaterWorks Silicon Valley was an incredible resource.
Yeah.
We fell in love with TheaterWorks.
We did.
Oh, we're, by the way, everybody, we're married.
No, we both did many of their New Works festivals.
Yeah.
And then they also, a lot of times they develop and produce from their New Work festival. So it's a great organization. But it's had a lot of challenges financially in the last several years, but that was many, many years. And one of the things I thought they did that was so beautiful was actually the way they handled their donors and the way that they connected their writers and their donors. And they would have these dinners and we would meet them. I mean, they're really fascinating, interesting people. And they were so clued into what we were trying to do. And they felt so invested in these New Work festivals. And you got to know them so well that then they were really excited to help fund those productions and help get those writers back to TheaterWorks. And it felt like a really vibrant ecosystem.
Yeah, they gave donors a sneak peek into the writers' process, but it was never annoying for the writers. They also respected the time that we had. They balanced that really well.
Yeah, building those relationships, because that's individual philanthropy is kind of what's left these days. Yeah. It's I've been very aware of the programs supporting musical theater, as well as the ones that support straight plays going away. All of the Humana Festival and just the Lark and all of these different resources that have been.
I love the Lark so
the backbone
much.
of the American theater and figuring out how to get good work produced and how to support writers with gifts who are honing those gifts.
Yeah.
And they're just going away. And what is the next iteration of new work development, whether it's plays or musicals, going to look like in our field? I think we don't know right now.
Right. One of my favorites that I got to be involved in, and they have a fellowship and they have a writers group and they do a bunch of other programs, and I've done several of them, is Page 73, which is out of Brooklyn. And they ended up bringing in Michael R. Jackson and Matt Schatz. And like they're one of the only organizations that I know that I am not the only musical theater writer who was involved in it. And they're primarily doing plays, but they also co-produced Strange Loop. Like they're doing really interesting things with that intersection between plays and musicals and things that are edgier.
Yeah. How do we find an organization, create an organization that will to give those kinds of supportive funds to writers, thinking what you were saying, Nathan, about sort of shopping around and being able to go places and go, hey, I got this Rogers grant. So here's some money that will make it affordable for your theater to develop our piece at your company. And, I did a couple of those during my New York director days. And, there's so much less of that now, and costs have gone up and financial support has gone down.
Yes.
And that math doesn't work out.
No, it really doesn't.
It really, really doesn't. And so to the earlier point, what are the new equations going to look like, and how do we build those, and who's going to help build them? It's not going to be the federal government. It's not likely to be state and local governments. It's not likely to be corporations. Which means we were once, we're back to the Gilded Age. And is it, just going to be philanthropists and foundations who are persuadable?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there's also in terms of those, like newer writers, I feel like there's also a world where you can do more bare bones things. There's ways to, like, if there was a grant that was just, it was like, if there's, if you can create an initiative that says write a two-person show, and it can't have more than this much set, and then like there's going to be 10 theaters that are going to produce one, and you could do some kind of initiative. Like, I feel like it has to be about, yes, yes, philanthropists, yes, there are going to be individual donors who become extraordinarily important to us, but also there's an entire network of theaters across the country, and I think musicals could make them money. People really like going to see musicals,
They do.
and and there's a lack of it in smaller not-for-profit theater because there's this pipeline problem. But if we could actually stop it from being about the the New York to regional theater pipeline, and use the internet, and use streaming, and use recordings, because that's actually where the majority of people are finding their music.
Hmm.
And you do those, like, say, those 5 world premieres all connected to each other, and by the end of that there's a recording of the whole thing, and all of those people, all of those theaters participate in whatever the rights are for that financially. Like, there's a way, like in the way that a producer would,
Hmm.
and then those theaters potentially make money in the long term. It all takes, there's a jumping off point, there's a like, you have to dive into the deep end with any of those things. But if you could create a situation where everyone was willing to dive together, I feel like there's probably ways to create a network of like a network and a pool of funds that are towards a goal.
I just have to say, Kate, that we frequently talk either amongst ourselves on this podcast or with guests where we talk about, some issue in our field that feels like an insurmountable problem. And it is very rare that we have a guest who comes on who's like, here's how we fix it. Here's an actionable plan. Let's make that happen. I mean, that sounds very pragmatic and doable to me.
I don't
And it
know.
builds
Can't we do
building on.
that?
I know. Well, and as you've said a couple times in this conversation, the rolling world premiere model is becoming more and more and more prevalent in the field, and I think that
Yeah.
is really good. And it's partly because it's making up for the disappearance of some other developmental supports. But it's great, and we're going to be doing more of them at Forward, and I know my peers around here are going to be doing more. Um, our World Premiere Wisconsin initiative to support new plays and musicals is coming back, and there's going to be more rolling world premieres that are part of that. So these kinds of models really are doable, and it's not
Yeah.
completely inventing it out of whole cloth. It
Right.
is it is building on some things that we already know work from different contexts and saying, hey, we are an experienced team of musical theater creators, and based on our experiences doing this for a while, this would really work.
Right.
And yeah, now we just need to find someone who says, great, I'll make it happen.
Yeah. They'll listen to this podcast and be like, okay, I'm in. And
Yeah.
then we'll just
This is
go.
the problem I
Um,
want to solve
I
because
thought
it's not
I thought
solvable.
about a place that does something similar to what I'm describing, which is it's different, but the Village Theater and actually Arizona Theater Company,
Mm,
both of them have two different, like, the Village Theater, and is it Seattle Rep? There's another theater that they work with, or maybe they just have 2 locations.
mm.
But basically, because they have 2 locations, and this is true of Arizona Theater
Yeah, because
Company,
they have Tucson and Phoenix. Yeah.
because they have 2 satellite locations, they can divide the costs of doing a musical between those 2 locations, and it therefore becomes more possible to do a musical. And they're both pretty successful at that. And that's sort of where that idea comes from, that, like, the combination of that and the, like, 5 rolling world premiere play idea, and that world premiere idea is something that people, that matters, that's a helpful tool.
Hmm.
um and allowing that to not be one theater, does it all feels very useful to me.
Yeah. Well, I like that idea. Is there anything coming up for either of you that you'd like to chat about or share before we start to wind down?
I'm doing a production of a new musical based on a novel, but it's based on like a French novel, so it feels pretty edgy. It's called The Heart, and it's going to be at La Jolla Playhouse this summer, which is a fantastic regional theater that does develop new musicals.
Yeah, they really do. That's exciting.
Yeah,
it's really good.
Totally unbiased.
Yeah, get ready. I would like to draw your attention, hopefully, to your desk where I have submitted 2 new musicals for Forward Theater Company. For real. Sent them to Scott Hayden.
Please.
So hopefully upcoming soon, once you read them and say, yes.
Yay.
I'll tell you right now that I don't have commercial producers, but I can get them for you. I mean, literally, that's what I'm doing. I wrote 2 shows during COVID. And in the middle of submitting them right now and just saying, it's like chicken or the egg, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I've given them to the producers and like, oh, I'm definitely interested in this. Do you have a step of development? Do you have a theater? No, right? What's the number? What do you need in order to make it happen? So kind of a joke, but also give them a read.
I will. I'm very excited because I love musicals and we don't do nearly enough of them at Forward. And I'm hoping to do a few more.
Just like Kate said at the beginning, they're both small little shows that regional theater should jump on.
There is nothing more really exciting than an intimate musical in an intimate space.
Yeah.
Agreed.
We went to go see the Jonathan Larson project at the Orpheum Theater, which is a downtown like East Village theater.
It's where Stomp played for decades, where Little Shop of Horrors played.
It's like tiny and amazing, and there was something, and it was 5 fantastic actors who we've known for a very long time, and there's something about being in a smaller space with a musical that I find to be so intimate and thrilling. And as much as I love our show on Broadway, it's so much fun. It's such and it's dream come true, like literal dream come true, one that I never actually imagined for myself. But there's something about going back to those smaller theaters that feels like, I don't know, it sort of feels like home to me. And there's something incredible about being that close to it.
Yeah.
And I miss it. I miss being able to see shows like that. And they don't happen very often.
Yeah. And listen, as much as we're bitching and complaining about finding homes for new work, we know that you are giving home to a lot of writers and bringing art to your community. And that's very, very important. So thank you for fighting the good fight.
And doing so much new work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. But I'm so grateful that you took the time to chat with us and share your perspective on the way the musical theater development world is working or maybe not working.
Hobbling forward. Yeah.
Right now. But this was a more hopeful conversation than I think it could have been, right?
Oh, good.
I think there were some great ideas and some real reasons for optimism in the midst of a lot of headwinds. And I can't wait to read the couple of musicals you're going to send our way.
Hey.
But I'll say that I think this is a great note to end this conversation on, though I would very happily keep going for the next several hours. But Kate and Nathan, I thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having
us. You're welcome.
And we will say that is all for this episode of Theater Forward, a conversation about theater in Wisconsin, the Midwest, and America. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jen Uphoff Gray, and our podcast is produced by Scott Hayden, favorite person of our guests. And you can follow us or share your thoughts on Facebook at Theater Forward, as always spelled with an ER. And if you enjoy the podcast, don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your recordings, and be sure to leave a comment. We would love to hear from you. We're very grateful to have you listening, and we will be back soon for another Theater Forward conversation.